Imagine planning a relaxing weekend with your closest friends, only to overhear your wife inviting another man into your home the moment you leave. That's exactly what happened to Ethan Collins. But instead of confronting her right away, he did something far more calculated. He watched, he gathered proof, and when the time was right, he executed the most brutal and public revenge imaginable. Stay with me, because this is a story of betrayal, patience, and the ultimate reckoning. Ethan Collins had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. At 37, he still felt the same rush he had as a teenager whenever he and his longtime friends planned their annual fishing trip. After over a decade working in supply chain management, he had developed a deep appreciation for order, and it showed in how he packed his gear. His tackle box was arranged with precision. Every lure, reel, and hook had its place. The rhythmic clicking of the compartments snapping shut was oddly satisfying, a small ritual that signaled the start of a weekend of peace and camaraderie. The garage smelled of motor oil and cut grass, a scent Ethan associated with quiet, predictable moments. He moved through the space with practiced ease, humming under his breath as he reached for his cooler. His favorite fishing rod, the one Laura had given him for their anniversary 3 years ago, rested against the workbench. He ran his fingers along the handle, feeling the familiar grooves where his hands had worn down the grip. Moments like these, surrounded by simple comforts, made him feel truly at ease. The garage door was slightly ajar, allowing a warm evening breeze to filter in. It also unknowingly created an unintended audio tunnel between the garage and the kitchen. As Ethan reached for the cooler, a voice drifted in from inside the house. Laura's voice. "He's gone for the weekend. You can come over tonight." His hand froze on the handle. For a moment, the words didn't register. Maybe he misheard. Maybe she was talking about something else. But the longer he stood there, the more the weight of her words settled into him. His wife of 11 years wasn't planning a quiet weekend alone. She was planning something else entirely. A strange stillness came over him. His mind started sorting through the past few months, suddenly connecting dots that had once seemed harmless. The late nights at work, the new clothes, the sudden interest in fitness when she had never cared before. Each memory shifted, taking on a new and sinister meaning. Ethan inhaled deeply through his nose, forcing his body to move again. With slow, deliberate motions, he continued packing his things as if nothing had changed. Every movement felt rehearsed, like he was watching himself from the outside. His mind was racing, but outwardly he was calm. By the time he had loaded his gear into the car, a decision had settled inside him. He wasn't going to the lake. Not yet. Instead, Ethan turned the key in the ignition and pulled down the street, parking in a secluded spot with a clear view of the house. His heart pounded as he sat in silence, staring at the home he had built, the life he had trusted. The urge to storm inside, to demand answers, to stop whatever was about to happen. It clawed at him. But another part of him, the part that had spent years learning patience and control, told him to wait. So he waited. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns. The neighborhood, full of families settling in for the night, felt like an entirely different world. His phone buzzed with messages from his friends, checking in, asking when he'd arrive. He typed out an excuse about a last-minute family issue and hit send. At 8:37 p.m., a sleek black sedan turned onto the street. Ethan's stomach churned as he recognized the car. Ryan Mitchell. Ryan had been in their house before. He worked with Laura, had shared beers at their backyard barbecues, had laughed at Ethan's jokes and complimented his grilling. It had all seemed normal at the time. Now, that familiarity felt like a knife twisting deeper. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he watched Ryan step out of the car, straighten his jacket, and walk up the driveway like he belonged there. Laura opened the door before he even had a chance to knock. Ethan didn't need to see what happened next to know exactly where this night was heading. Ethan sat motionless in his car, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath came in slow, measured inhales, but inside, his mind was a storm. His house, his wife, and another man walking through the front door like he belonged there. Part of him wanted to slam the car into drive, peel into the driveway, and tear the entire facade apart. Demand answers. Demand the truth. But the rational part of him, the side that had always prided itself on patience and control, kept him frozen in place. Storming in now wouldn't change the reality. It wouldn't undo what had already happened. Instead, he watched. Minutes turned into an hour. The house lights flickered on and off, illuminating the shadows shifting inside. At 9:15, the living room lights dimmed. He pictured them on the couch. The same couch where he and Laura had spent so many nights wrapped in each other's arms. At 9:30, the bedroom light blinked on. A cold, sharp pain sliced through his chest. That was their bedroom, their space, the place where he had once felt safest. His grip on his phone tightened. He wasn't leaving. Pulling up the camera app, he zoomed in, steadying his hand despite the tremor running through him. He recorded everything, the moment Ryan arrived, the way Laura welcomed him inside, the way the house came alive at all the wrong moments. Every piece of evidence, every undeniable confirmation of the truth, he captured. At 11:52, the backyard lights clicked on. Ethan shifted, angling for a better view. Laura and Ryan stepped outside, wrapped in robes, moving toward the hot tub. The hot tub, the one Ethan had installed as a surprise for their 10th anniversary, thinking it would be a place for them to unwind together, reconnect after long days. Now it had become part of someone else's story, someone else's pleasure. A fresh wave of nausea rolled through him, but he forced himself to keep filming. Hours passed. His body stiffened from sitting so long, but he didn't move. He ignored the cramp in his legs, the dull ache in his back. His only focus was what was happening inside that house. He had to know the full extent of her betrayal. Somewhere in the early morning hours, exhaustion took over. He dozed off, his head slumping against the window. The sound of a car door jolted him awake. His gaze snapped toward the driveway just in time to see Ryan stepping out of the house, glancing around as if checking to see if anyone had noticed. He adjusted his shirt, raking a hand through his hair before making his way back to his car. Ethan raised his phone again, capturing Ryan's quiet, shameful exit. As the sedan rolled down the street, Ethan remained seated in his car, watching the house as the first light of morning crept over the rooftops. There was no more room for doubt. Laura wasn't just cheating. She had built an entire secret life right under his nose. A part of him had still wanted to believe in an innocent explanation. But now, faced with irrefutable proof, something inside him hardened. This wasn't just about anger anymore. It wasn't even about heartbreak. It was about taking control. With a deep breath, Ethan turned the key in the ignition and drove away. Not to the lake, not to his friends, but to the start of a plan that would ensure Laura's lies unraveled exactly the way they deserved to. Ethan drove aimlessly for a while, his mind cycling through every possible reaction. He could walk into that house right now, confront Laura, demand answers. But what would that accomplish? She would lie. She would twist the truth. Maybe she'd even try to turn things around on him, make him feel like he was imagining things. No, he needed a plan, one that ensured she couldn't manipulate her way out of this. By the time he pulled into a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, his decision was made. He wasn't going to act on impulse. He was going to dismantle the situation the way he had built every success in his life, carefully, deliberately, and with absolute control. Laura didn't know it, but their finances were about to change. Ethan spent the next few days opening a private bank account in his name only. He redirected his paycheck deposits there, ensuring he had access to his own money when the time came to leave. He started moving small amounts, nothing noticeable, just enough to create a cushion. He also began tracking their shared expenses, making notes of every suspicious charge on their joint credit card. Dinners at restaurants he'd never heard of, hotel stays under her name, lingerie that had never made an appearance in their bedroom. It was all adding up to the kind of evidence that would be impossible to explain away. If Ethan was going to fight for custody of his daughter, he needed to make sure there was no question about who the stable parent was. He started paying closer attention to Sophie, noticing things he had overlooked before. The way she hesitated before mentioning her mother. The quiet disappointment in her eyes when Laura missed another school event. The way she barely reacted when Ethan asked if her mom would be home for dinner. One night, as they sat eating takeout at the kitchen table, Laura conveniently working late again, Sophie sighed, pushing her food around her plate. "Is Mom mad at me?" she asked suddenly. Ethan froze. "What? No, of course not. Why would you think that? She just never seems to have time for me anymore." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. This wasn't just about him. Laura's choices weren't just affecting their marriage. They were affecting their daughter. And that was something he couldn't forgive. From that night on, he made a point of being more present. He helped her with her homework, took her out for ice cream after school, made sure she never felt like she was on the outside of her own family. He wasn't just collecting evidence. He was making sure that when everything fell apart, Sophie knew she had one parent she could count on. Ethan met with a divorce attorney, laying out everything he had gathered so far. The photos, the credit card statements, the videos. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Vanessa Grant, flipped through the folder of evidence, nodding as she scanned the details. "You've done a lot of the groundwork already. This is solid. If we play this right, we can make sure you come out of this with primary custody." Ethan exhaled, tension easing in his chest for the first time in days. "That's all I care about." "Good," Vanessa said, setting the folder aside. "But if we want to maximize your position, you need to keep playing along for now. Don't tip her off. Keep acting like nothing has changed." It was the hardest part. Every morning, he kissed Laura goodbye before heading to work. Every evening, he asked about her day as if he didn't already know who she had been with. He even initiated intimacy a few times just to keep her from suspecting that anything was wrong. It was a performance and it made his skin crawl. But he knew it was necessary. One evening, Ethan reached out to Sarah Mitchell, Ryan's wife. They had never been particularly close, but he knew her well enough to know she deserved better than what was happening behind her back. Under the pretense of organizing a surprise anniversary party for Laura, he invited Sarah to coffee. "Ryan talks about you all the time," she said with a smile, stirring sugar into her drink. "He says you're one of the most reliable guys he's ever met." Ethan forced a tight smile. He could barely stomach hearing Ryan's name, let alone the idea that he was being praised by the man sleeping with his wife. They made small talk for a while, but Ethan steered the conversation toward their spouses' work schedules, subtly probing to see if the puzzle pieces fit. They did. The nights Laura was supposedly working late, those were the same nights Sarah's book club met, the nights she wasn't home. The pattern was undeniable. By the time they finished their drinks, Ethan knew Sarah would start noticing things on her own. He didn't have to say anything outright. The doubt was already planted. Ethan had no intention of confronting Laura in private. That would give her a chance to control the narrative, to manipulate the situation. Instead, he was going to make sure the truth came out in a way she couldn't deny. Their 15th anniversary was coming up, and Ethan suggested a party. A big one with family, friends, and colleagues. "We've been through so much together," he said, forcing a smile. "We should celebrate properly." Laura hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe just a quiet dinner." "Nonsense. 15 years is a big deal. We should do it right." He could see the discomfort in her eyes. She didn't want all those people around. She didn't want to be in a room full of people who would eventually know the truth. But she couldn't refuse without looking suspicious. So she agreed. And Ethan knew her downfall was already in motion. The night of the anniversary party arrived, and Ethan had never felt more in control of a situation in his life. Every detail had been meticulously planned, every step executed with precision. His expression remained calm, his voice steady, his movements deliberate. To everyone in the room, he looked like a man celebrating 15 years of marriage. But in reality, he was a man preparing to dismantle a carefully constructed lie. The restaurant's private dining room buzzed with warmth and laughter. The soft clinking of champagne glasses, the murmur of friendly conversation. It was exactly the kind of scene Laura would have wanted under normal circumstances. But Ethan had been watching her closely all evening, and he could tell she was on edge. Her smiles were too tight, her laughter too forced. She knew something was wrong, even if she didn't know exactly what. Across the room, Ryan and Sarah arrived. Ethan didn't miss the way Laura stiffened slightly, how her fingers toyed with the stem of her wine glass. Ryan barely met her gaze, his own expression strained. Sarah, on the other hand, was radiant, completely unaware of the storm about to hit. Ethan played his role flawlessly, making small talk, shaking hands, laughing at the right moments. He moved through the room like a man with nothing to hide, keeping his emotions locked beneath the surface. He didn't need to force anything. The truth would speak for itself soon enough. Midway through dinner, he stood. A gentle clinking of his glass silenced the room. All eyes turned to him, including Laura's. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Friends, family," Ethan began, his voice warm and steady. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate 15 years of marriage with Laura and me. It means the world to have all of you here." The screen behind him flickered to life, displaying the first slide of the presentation he had prepared. Photos from their wedding day, vacations, birthdays. Smiling faces. Happy memories. A carefully curated timeline of a life built together. Laura relaxed slightly, sipping her wine. "When I met Laura," Ethan continued, "I thought I was the luckiest man alive, and for many years, I was sure of it." A few guests chuckled. Laura reached for his hand, squeezing it lightly. Ethan let her. "But life," he said, his tone shifting slightly, "has a way of surprising you, doesn't it?" He clicked the remote in his hand, and the next slide appeared. Text messages. The room went silent. Laura's grip on his hand tightened, then released entirely. Ethan clicked again. More messages. Explicit. Undeniable. The words exchanged between her and Ryan were laid out in perfect clarity, leaving no room for interpretation. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A murmur of confusion and shock spread like wildfire. Another click. Photos. Ryan and Laura at a hotel. Their cars parked side by side in a quiet part of town. Another click. Security footage. Ryan entering Ethan's house while Ethan was supposed to be away. The silence in the room was deafening. Laura had gone completely still, her face drained of color. Ryan looked like he wanted to disappear. Sarah stared at the screen, her mouth slightly open, realization settling in like a punch to the stomach. Ethan turned to the room. "Sometimes," he said, his voice measured, "the surprises life throws at you aren't the good kind." Laura pushed back her chair abruptly, knocking her wine glass over. "Ethan," she started, her voice shaking. "I don't." He cut her off, his tone sharper than before. He wasn't interested in excuses. Tom and Diane, Laura's parents, stood frozen in disbelief. Her father's jaw was clenched so tightly it looked painful. Her mother covered her mouth, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Sarah turned to Ryan, her face contorted with anger and betrayal. "Tell me this isn't real." Ryan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The final slide appeared. Divorce papers, already signed by Ethan. "This," Ethan said, motioning toward the screen, "is my anniversary gift to you, Laura. Congratulations." The room erupted into chaos. Laura bolted up, reaching for Ethan's arm. "Please, let's talk about this in private." Ethan stepped back. "Oh, now you want privacy?" He let out a cold laugh. "Funny, considering how much you enjoyed letting Ryan into our home." Ryan, now fully panicked, tried to slip away, but Sarah grabbed his wrist. "You disgust me," she spat, voice thick with fury. "I believed every lie you told me." The weight of everything crashed into Laura at once. Her parents wouldn't meet her gaze. Her friends whispered among themselves. Her colleagues, many of whom had come from work, were already pulling out their phones, no doubt ready to discuss the scandal first thing in the morning. Laura turned back to Ethan. "This doesn't have to end like this." "Oh, but it does." Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out a few neatly sealed envelopes. He handed one to her parents, one to Sarah, and another to a particularly nosy coworker. Everything you need to know is in here. Feel free to take your time reading it. He turned to the rest of the guests. I apologize for the spectacle, he said smoothly. But I figured if Laura wanted to live a lie, she should at least have the decency to do it in front of an audience. With that, Ethan turned and walked out. The night air hit him like a breath of fresh oxygen. His heart was still pounding, adrenaline still coursing through his veins, but a strange sense of relief settled over him. It was done. There were still battles ahead, the legal fight, the custody discussions, the fallout. But tonight, Ethan Collins had taken back control. The morning after the anniversary party, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee in front of him. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that only followed a storm. His phone buzzed nonstop, missed calls, texts, voicemails. Most were from Laura. He ignored them all. He had said everything he needed to say. By midday, the fallout had already begun. Word had spread through their social circles, their workplace, even among their neighbors. Laura had wasted no time trying to spin the story, painting herself as the victim of an unforgiving husband who had publicly humiliated her. But Ethan had been prepared for this. For every person who reached out with concern or skepticism, he responded with one simple message: check your email. Attached were all the receipts, the messages, the photos, the proof. Cold, undeniable facts. By the afternoon, the calls slowed. The apologies started trickling in. His next step was securing his future, starting with custody of Sophie. He met with his lawyer, Vanessa, who had already anticipated Laura's next move. She's going to try and play the loving mother card, Vanessa said, flipping through the documents Ethan had provided. But this evidence? It's damning. The court won't look kindly on a parent who prioritizes an affair over their own child. Sophie was the one person Ethan refused to let suffer for Laura's mistakes. In the days that followed, he made sure his daughter felt stability despite the chaos. He kept their routines the same: breakfast before school, helping with homework, movie nights on Fridays. He didn't bring up the divorce unless she did. When she finally did ask, it was simple. Are you going to be okay, Dad? He looked at her, the girl who had always seen him as unshakable. He owed her the truth. I will be, he said, and so will you. The divorce process was swift. Ethan's preparation left Laura with little room to fight. She had no leverage, no ground to stand on. When the final papers were signed, Ethan was granted primary custody of Sophie. Laura was given supervised visitation twice a month. She was furious. She called him late one night, voice raw with emotion. Ethan, please, we can fix this. We can find a way back. There is no way back, he replied, his voice steady. Only forward. She sobbed on the other end, but he didn't stay on the line to listen. She had made her choices. Ethan focused on rebuilding, not just for Sophie, but for himself. With the divorce finalized, he poured his energy into creating a life that was entirely his own. He paid off the remaining mortgage, ensuring their home was secure. He set up a college fund for Sophie, determined to give her every opportunity she deserved. At work, his quiet resilience didn't go unnoticed. A few weeks after the divorce was finalized, his supervisor called him in. Collins, he said, leaning back in his chair. I've been watching how you've handled yourself these past few months. Impressive, considering everything. Ethan remained silent, waiting. We've got a leadership position open. More pay, more flexibility. The man tilted his head. Interested. Ethan accepted on the spot. The raise meant more security, more freedom to be there for Sophie. It was a reminder that life didn't stop just because something painful had happened. It moved forward, and he was moving with it. Laura's downfall. Laura's life, however, took a different turn. After the party, she lost almost everything. Ryan predictably vanished. When faced with the public disgrace, he did what cowards do. He cut his losses and left. Laura lost her job, thanks to the workplace complaint Ethan had anonymously submitted. With her reputation in shambles, she struggled to find new work. She eventually moved to another city, starting over where her name wasn't synonymous with betrayal. She reached out occasionally, but Ethan kept his responses brief. Sophie spoke to her less and less, the connection strained. One day, Sophie came home from a weekend visit and simply said, "I think she's lonely." Ethan nodded, but said nothing. There was nothing he could do about that point. 2 years passed. Ethan and Sophie had built something new, a life not defined by what they had lost, but by what they had gained. One crisp autumn morning, they packed up their gear and drove out to the lake. The same lake Ethan had been headed to the night he first discovered the truth. Sophie cast her line into the water, a peaceful silence settling over them. "You know," Ethan said, watching the sun reflect off the rippling surface, "my dad used to bring me here when I was your age." Sophie smiled, glancing at him. "And now you're bringing me."
À tradition.
Ethan nodded, feeling something settle in his chest. Not pain, not regret, just peace. The storm had passed, and in its wake, a new life had begun.